Hey, everybody, this is Eric Mishi, Executive Director of SAVE, Suicide Awareness Voices of Education. We are continuing our week-long series of conversations with folks that are in a variety of different places, different organizations playing a role in talking about mental health, suicide awareness, suicide prevention. We're talking about how do each of us play a role in helping to save lives, whether you're an expert or whether just a average person on the street who may be interested in wanting to get involved, and how can you make a difference in helping save a life. Perhaps suicide loss survivors. We've got some conversations coming up today with how suicide loss survivors have taken that grief that they've experienced and tried to pay it forward in different ways as part of their healing process to support and help others. And so this conversation, looking forward to this is with Dr. Lesli Preuss, who not only happens to be a licensed clinical child and family psychologist, but is also a SAVE board member. Hello, Lesli.
Hello, good morning to everybody.
How are you doing? Well, good morning in California. For those of us in the
Correct.
Midwest, not so much. So you can't start any conversation if you're a Midwesterner without asking about how's the weather in California.
We are thrilled to be out of our heat wave finally, and we dropped about 60 degrees overnight. So we went from about 110 down to 49 overnight, and I think we're up at a balmy 70, which is lovely. So
That's very lovely. That's almost Midwestern kind of weather. So
yeah.
so let's start out with maybe just sharing a little bit about background about you and the work that you do, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. So I'm a licensed child and family psychologist, clinical psychologist, and have been now for 25 years, which seems impossible. I've worked all over the country. So worked on the East Coast, Midwest, now out in the West Coast. And I specialize in kids and adolescents, specifically twice exceptional kids, but also kids who are on the autism spectrum and have other various mental health disorders, and have worked on suicide prevention and intervention since, well, since the early 2000s, actually, where I was at the University of Michigan Medical Center in their suicide clinic and in the inpatient units. So then
So
went from there.
in the 25 years you've been doing this work, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen as you've worked with families, you've worked with kids? You know, what perhaps maybe start with what have been some of the most challenging changes that you've seen in the landscape in your work?
And I think the most challenging changes have actually been the entree of social media and the decreasing ages at which kids are exposed to media and social media, just media in general, but then also social media, their access to online information, which is somewhat regardless of their developmental stage once they get on it. You know, I tell parents this, it's like unleashing a kid into a mall by themselves. You know, that you have no idea what they're going to encounter once they get online and onto the internet. So I think that's been one of the biggest challenges. Also, I guess it's more in LA, although somewhat in the Midwest and East Coast as well, but an increasing isolation of kids. As they got onto social media, computers, things like that, they retreated more and more to their rooms, their own space, their own privacy domain, because when they're on Discord or they're on Facebook or they're on, Snapchat or Instagram, they're in their own world and there's not a lot. You know, we used to sit on the phone in the kitchen with a 25-foot cord where everyone could hear what you were saying. And if they wanted to pick up the other phone at any time and intervene, there wasn't as much isolation, privacy, and I think it has been really difficult for kids to navigate that because they are not developmentally ready, and yet they're exposed to it very young, and then they learn to expect it and want it because everybody else has it. That's an age-old aphorism, right?
Yeah.
But everybody's doing it. Everybody has it. And parents fight that all the time and lose the battle because, in fact, everybody has a phone now at age 7. Everybody has access to Instagram, Snapchat, everything by the time they're 10. And that's a lot. It's a lot to expect of a kid. And I think the demands of that, the confusion around it, how to manage all of it is way too much.
Yeah, and we'll come back and chat a little bit more about the social media part of this thing. But so I'm curious, I remember when my kids were born and they were young, and my wife and I were trying to figure out how we're supposed to raise these kids, and how are we supposed to take care of them, get them out of trouble. And I remember we went to a presentation by a licensed child psychologist who talked to us about adolescent brain development, and it was both terrifying and fascinating as parents to try to deal with this concept of adolescent brain development and how does it change and how does it grow from, how do you go, from toddlers to adolescents and young adults and teenagers. And so as you have been in this field and dealing with adolescent brain behavior, and particularly things like impulse control and how do parents deal with modern day technology and the impact that it's had on behavioral issues. How do you what are the kind of things and the kind of tools that you try to equip parents with, particularly as you mentioned, these have become, they're not quite yet embedded in our physical being, but they're pretty close.
They may as well be at this point.
And so how do you prepare parents? How do you help them navigate that in an environment in which their kids have never not known that technology?
I think it's a really tough question, but one of the things that I emphasize a lot with families is modeling. Modeling hasn't changed. It's monkey see, monkey do. So if a kid is watching a parent sit on their phone all through dinner, or be watching a show together, we're watching the movie together, but both parents are sitting back doing their work while the movie's going on, the kids are going to pick up their iPads, they're going to pick up their devices and do the same thing. So I really caution parents to watch their own behavior, and we're all guilty of it. We are as attached to these devices as the kids are. Everyone says, oh, it's the kids. I will tell you, parents and adults are just as bad, if not worse at some level, because we didn't grow up with it. So we don't regulate it as well sometimes as some of the kids actually do. But they're watching all of that. And if a parent is on their phone, but then screaming up to a kid, come on, get ready for school, but they're not really involved in the process, the kid's not really involved in the process.
Yeah.
So I encourage a lot of the parents, if we are banking phones, I've encouraged lots of, charging times, and which is a decharging time for all the humans and a charging time for all, put them all away somewhere, out of sight, out of mind. Put them in there to charge and do what they've got to do for work the next day, for school the next day, and go play a game together. Get outside and play, be involved, ask questions. When the kids are on them, lay next to them and figure out what they're watching. Hey, what's that? How do you do that? What's this Snapchat that you show me? It's okay to be a little bit of a little bit bumbling with this stuff, and let the kids teach you, because it gets you involved. It keeps you in their world. You get to see a little more of what they're doing, who they're talking to, what's going on, what topics are being discussed or talked about. So I think a lot of it is modeling, and then just remembering that you have to be involved. You've got to get off your phone and put it away in order to see what they're doing.
I think this modeling thought is really important. And I will tell you that I have been as guilty as anybody of that, with my phones and things like that. My children, who are now young adults, will prod me on that. And so, and as you said, as adults, we may actually have maybe worse at it than certainly the kids have been at it. So one of the kind of emerging topics of conversation in this space, and it's taken hold in schools really all across the country, and if it's not necessarily taken hold as a policy, is certainly being discussed as a policy, is this idea of literally taking kids' cell phones out of the classroom, removing those phones from being in the classroom, taking away from them. How do you suppose young people ultimately will react to this idea that something, again, that for many of them, they've had these in their possession for many years, and it's become, whether you want to call it a safety blanket or whatever it is, that we're now being told that, the best thing that we can do to protect kids within the classroom environment in terms of learning is to take those phones away from them. Yes, no, what's your thought?
Well, it's fascinating that you brought it up, because Los Angeles Unified, which is one of the largest school districts in the country, just did this. Starting in September, there are no phones in the classrooms at all. They have to check them into a into a packet, they
Yep.
zip them up, and they pick them up at the end of the day. So they are not going to have them for the first time. And it has been fascinating to me. A lot of the kids are kind of enjoying it. They like the release of pressure of not, they just can't check it. They can't be in touch. They can't be getting texts. So they're not having as visceral of a response as I think all the adults predicted, but the parents are having a fit. But I need to reach my kid. What if something bad happens? How are they going to find me? The anxiety it has created on behalf of the parents to not have that constant access, to not be able to reach them at any moment, has been way worse, I would say, for the moms and dads than it has been for the kids, who were kind of like, great. At first there was some grumbling about it. You don't have the right to do that. It's my property. You can't touch it, blah, blah, blah. Like that kind of grumbling.
Mm-hmm.
But now that it's gone, I am not hearing, in my office, I'm not hearing a single complaint from the kids other than, oh my gosh, by the time I get done, all my friends in other districts have sent me all these messages, like they, and it's more become a joke, they're like, what, do they not pay attention in class? And it's become almost a pride thing in an interesting way.
Yep.
They feel more engaged, more affiliated with their classes, their teachers, their peers. A lot of the kids like it because we're actually having conversations at lunch now. We go and play soccer. We go and play games in a way. So they're kind of enjoying it. I think it was a gift all around. But it is interesting that we've got to do some education with the parents about it's okay. If something happens, if there is an emergency, they will find a way to notify you. You will know, you will get, so the anxiety has really been on the parental side.
It's fascinating because I was called into a public radio show, I think yesterday or the day before, where this topic was being talked about. And one of the principals from a school that has now implemented this, his response when they asked, what's been the result? What's been the response from the kids? And he said, surprisingly, he goes, the kids actually have told us that they like this because it takes away a level of anxiety and stress that they don't have to deal with in that period of time. But it's the parents who clearly have become the most anxious about it. And even as I say this out loud, I mean, I grew up in a family of 9 kids, and I will tell you, my mother had no idea where most of us were at any given time of day. And there was no pager, there was no cell phone, there was no, hey, I got to find out where he's at. I got to look on my iPhone and see where his iPhone is at. And somehow or another, all 9 of us seem to have survived that experience of not having our mom be able to know where we were every second, every minute of the day. As a parent today, I will tell you that notion of not being able to have that immediate lifeline, if you will, to my kid.
Well, they're tracking them. I mean, most of these parents have them on a location finder of some kind. They are watching them every step they take, and that's now been taken away to a certain extent. Now, these kids should be in the school building. Like they shouldn't be going far from that area. But it is incredibly anxiety provoking for the parents. And what I will say, I think this harkens back to a piece that, and I think impacts suicide prevention, the sense of community. I grew up the way that you grew up. We wandered around. I mean, I call us feral children, but we weren't. You know why? Because I had 200 aunts and uncles in the neighborhood who were all watching me, knew who I was, knew who my parents were, knew who my brothers were, they knew exactly where I was in the beehive. So it may not have been my mom who knew, but I'll tell you, 10 other parents knew where I was. And if I was going to act up at all, they had no qualms about either walking over to our house, disciplining me right there, or calling my parents and saying, you may want to check in, she's making some bad choices, and we could discuss whether they were bad choices or not a different day. But in their mind, my parents should know about what was happening. We don't have that anymore. I certainly never felt it with our dog, especially here in LA. Everyone drives, you get in a car, you go to a place, you get back in a car, you go back home, you don't talk to your neighbors, you're all spread out. No one, it's fascinating. And I think that was the security blanket for all of us. Like your mom may not have known, but somebody knew where you were. Somebody.
Yeah, trust me, when I got home, somebody would have called her and told her what it was that I was doing I shouldn't be doing. So, so that was, but the, I've talked to my mom's now 92, and I will from time to time ask her, how did you manage that? She goes, I figured that you guys were fine, right? That you were a good kid, right? It was, you're a good kid, you weren't going to get in trouble. And you're like, well, yeah, we were really good kids. But now I mean, again, I will say that I can understand that anxiety, right? That angst that parents today have, because I'm part of that generation that when my kids were growing up, there was no way that I would not have been able to get a hold of them some way, shape, or form. And to be able to be a parent and have somebody say, you can't do that anymore, taking away that kind of power, control, whatever it is you want to call that. I can understand that.
Sense of security. Just
Yeah,
because we can reach them doesn't mean that they're safe. Just because I know where my daughter's iPhone is does not mean she's safe. But somehow it made us all feel as parents that they were safer.
yeah,
That if we knew where they were somehow safer. There's no reality to that. And I try to help parents understand that. Just because they're still at that house, or at least their phone is, because I'll tell you, I mean, I know what the kids were up to. I know what our daughter did. They left their phones at the house they were supposed to be having a sleepover at, and then they all went out. That's part of the game, right? They're still adolescents. They still want their freedoms. They still want their, independence and that feeling of I've got this. So it was a false sense of security in a lot of ways. And I'm trying to help parents understand that now, that just because their phones are turned in the office does not equate with either less safe or more safe.
yeah.
If something's going to happen in that building, it was going to happen whether they had their phones or not. We recently had a bomb threat. There was a school shooting in Georgia. I mean, these are horrific events.
Yep.
However, parents knowing that instantly doesn't stop anything that's going to go on in that building.
Yeah.
In fact, sometimes it makes it worse. Like the one that we had locally it was a fake threat. It was during finals, whatever. You can all put the pieces together, but kids did not have finals that day. But what happened is the kids started texting parents. Every parent in the local area jumped in their cars and rushed out to the school to save their kid.
Yeah.
It created absolute chaos for the poor first responders who were like, oh my gosh, we had 4,000 kids to deal with plus the staff. Now we have, 4,000 parents that we have to cope with on top of all this other stuff.
Yeah.
It created an absolutely nightmare situation for them.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure it actually makes it better all the time either.
Yeah, nothing ever. There's nothing ever 100% or black and white on these things. So let's shift gears a little bit, because I want to talk a little bit about kind of social media. I want to talk about data that we're starting to see, and data that we've actually seen since social media really became, ubiquitous in our lives. But there was a new study came out from the National Institute of Mental Health recently that talks about preteen suicide rates among kids between the ages of 8 and 12 rose 8% annually from 2008 to 2022. If you look at the data from the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, they rank suicide as the second leading cause of death for kids ages 10 to 14. And it shouldn't surprise anybody that a lot of this data mirrors when a lot of these social media platforms and electronic platforms really became ubiquitous in the early 2000s. And we had started to see suicide rates among many of these age demographics actually going down. And then when you saw a lot of these platforms go active and become accessible, they started to go up. We've been very involved in these conversations about how do we put some guardrails on some of these platforms, given the fact that more and more, particularly with Instagram and Snapchat and things like this. So in your practice, as you talk with parents and you talk with kids, you mentioned that the social media part of this thing is clearly a problem and a challenge. And what are those conversations that you're having about those issues?
It's such a broad topic, but we are often talking about exposure levels, how much time kids are on them. We know that there's a direct correlation between increased depression, increased anxiety, and more exposure. increased exposure. So it's really, setting limits and sticking to them, helping kids not be, like I said, so isolated in their social media approaches. What are you looking at? Let me be your friend so I can see what you're looking at. I can see what people are writing to you. Because the feedback can be tough, and COVID did a lot of damage with this because kids became very isolated, and what was their outlet? Social media. And they got exposed. I mean, eating disorders went up, anxiety went up, depression went up. We watch it just skyrocket. And those are all precursors to things like suicide risk, right? So that it is all going to increase together. And so it's really coaching parents, kids, because kids have to take some ownership of this too. You've been on it enough. Like, what more are you getting from being on TikTok for another hour? Yeah. What more data? What more information? You know what? Let's go outside. Let's go play. Let's be with some other kids. Go outside, ride your bikes, do something so that you're part of the real world. It's interesting because there's this whole concept of RL versus online, right? These kids are like, oh no, he's a real life friend. He's an online friend. He's a real life friend.
Yeah.
There's a big difference. And sometimes I'm not totally opposed to the online friends. It's not that it's all one or all the other. It's about moderation and balance and helping kids understand that an online friend fills a role. But then you have to balance that with real life friends because you're getting a different kind of feedback, a different kind of interaction, a different kind of socialization by interacting with somebody across the table from you versus a faceless, nameless person on a screen. And so those are kind of the conversations we're having. And it really is about balance. You're never going to convince a kid that they should never have an online friend. It's just not. It's part of their world.
Yeah.
And it's a great way in some ways for some of these quirkier kids to find their people, to find someone who likes what they like, who has this unique interest, whatever that may be. I've got a whole group of kids right now super into mushrooms and mycology. Well, they found their people online, and that's not a bad thing. It's like, see, I'm not weird. Lots of people like this, right? And I think there's a real benefit to that because then they don't feel alone. Whereas when you're one of 100 kids in a private school in West LA, you may not have another kid who is super passionate about whatever. So I think it does serve a benefit, but you've got to balance that and find some time and space.
Yeah. And that has been a lot of our conversation, right? Which is, the goal here, again, you kind of come back to the phone, the kids today, you're not going to unring this bell, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to say, you know what, you can't be on Instagram, you can't be on Snapchat, you can't be on TikTok. I mean, go back 20 or 30 years and think of our parents telling us what it is we weren't going to be able to do. It was more likely inclined to say, well, that's fine, I'll do it anyhow.
The other problem with that is you almost create more isolation for these kids.
That's right.
Because they're not wrong. When they say everybody's on it, they're kind of right. I mean, everybody is on it, including their parents and their siblings and their cousins. And so it's really teaching them how to use it responsibly, because if your kid is the only kid in the entire school who does not have a phone and has never seen or heard of Instagram, no one's hanging out with that kid. They feel weird to them, like it doesn't serve the kids' purposes. So I think that's important to put out there because a lot of parents view it as an extreme. Either they have it all or they have none of it, and it can't be. It really is the responsible use of it. But go ahead.
I agree with that. And you'd mentioned this part about quirky kids, right? And the mushroom thing, right? My son is big, into history and Civil War and kind of D&D, right? So, we talk about every Thursday, the nerds come over to our house to play Dungeons and Dragons, right? And we say it with, we love it. We love having them there. But, social media has given a route and a platform and a vehicle for kids who are, underrepresented or not seen and not heard and often not found. And so this idea that you would yank this away from them when this is where they have found some meaning, they found some purpose, and they found connection.
Like they belong somewhere, which are huge. These are all protective factors. When we talk about suicide, like a lot of times we talk about risk factors, but we forget to talk about the protective factors.
That's right.
And there's a number of them out there, and belonging is a huge one. Feeling a sense of belonging or purpose is huge in terms of prevention. So
yeah, and that's one of the things, when we talk to policymakers about, look, the goal here isn't to shut down kids' access to social media. It's not to shut down their access to the internet or electronic platforms. It is about making sure that when they are engaged and involved in these platforms, that the technology companies that created them have the same technology to be able to put in guardrails that protect kids, right? Protect girls from being, sextorted on Instagram, right? That can protect, young kids from buying fentanyl on Snapchat. I mean, those technologies exist. They have the capacity to do those things. They can put those guardrails in place without diminishing kids' access. And that, again, your point about that sense of belonging. I mean, the U.S. Surgeon General has declared that, loneliness in this country is a public health crisis. And, whether you're a kid in LA or you're a kid in Fargo, North Dakota, COVID and all of the subsequent kind of elements of that created that sense of being out there in a desert by yourself. And these platforms, provided those connections in that community to kids at a time when they were desperately looking for somebody to stay connected to. So, but this concept of balance that you mentioned, incredibly important. Educating parents that the goal here isn't to take things away from kids, but it's to moderate and balance that usage.
and use it as another vehicle to be involved in your kids' lives. Because what else do we know? The more communication there is in the household, the less likely that kid will be depressed, anxious, suicidal, or at least you'll know about it earlier, right? So you can put some interventions in place and give them, some platform to talk about whatever's going on. But you don't know if you're not communicating. And
Right.
sometimes that is via text. I have so many parents and kids who are texting while they're in their own house together. And I used to have a very visceral response to that. But I've also learned that sometimes kids can't say it to your face. It's too embarrassing or scary, or they're not sure. So they can send you a quick text saying, you know what, I'm feeling a little bit depressed. I don't know what to do. And it's easier to write that than to say it to your face or sit at the dinner table and announce it to the whole family. And it gives you a vehicle to then get up and go in their room and say, what's going on? And I use it a lot in my practice. Parents are shocked. They're like, you really want my kid texting you? I said, yes. You know why? Kids are extremely respectful about it, way more than adults. Adults will email me, text me at midnight, 1 a.m, whatever, because they're upset. Kids will inevitably write, I hope it's not bothering you, but I wanted to let you know something. Or I think we should talk about this in our next session. Or, hey, this really bothered me today, and I think I'll forget by the time I see you, but I wanted to let you know. And I get little tiny texts that just keep me posted, but it's a reach out. It's a place for them to go with these feelings that feel overwhelming in the moment, that they can get it out and then move on with their day.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually an incredibly valuable tool that I never foresaw myself using it that way, but I actually think it's been a huge addition to the practice. And I encourage all my supervisees to do it. I'm like, look, they've got to talk to somebody, and it's better to go out to a professional than maybe the kid in the bathroom at school, like let them have at least that choice.
Yeah. Yeah. This half hour, as I said, was going to go fast. It's gone fast. As we end each of these conversations, Leslie, we, at the end of the day, our organization is about bringing people hope, right? Whether it's bringing hope to prevent suicide, it's bringing hope to someone who's a suicide loss survivor. So we want to kind of end each of these conversations with some kind of message of hope. And so I'm going to ask you, as you talk to the folks that you work with, you talk to the folks that you hang out with, what's an important message of hope that you want to deliver during Suicide Prevention Awareness Month about what we can do to help one another deal with this challenge?
I mean, I think it's there, and we've talked about different formats, whether it's social media, phones, whatever, but communicate. Really use your words and talk to each other. Say hi. You never know. Even with your kid, just walk up and give them a hug, because you never know what's going on inside their head. And it can make or break the day for someone when you don't even realize it. So we're all part of a community. We're one giant pack. So we just use that and use the skills and the tools that we're given to keep up the communication and keep it as open as possible.
Those are hopeful words. Thank you, Leslie. It's great
Always
to
a
chat with
pleasure.
you.
Always a pleasure. We'll talk soon.
Very good. Thanks, Leslie.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
for having me.